The road was never just asphalt. It was a vein through pasture and pine, a ribbon laid by a grandfather with a borrowed grader and a stubborn belief that the land should breathe. It curled from the county lane, crossed a low-water creek, then rose in an easy S-curve toward the ridge where my house sat with its porch facing east. On fog mornings, the bend held the mist like cotton, and deer left crescent prints along the edges where gravel softened into loam. Delivery drivers used it, neighbors borrowed it. But it was my road, recorded, surveyed, taxed, maintained, and lived with. The first sign that the HOA had different plans arrived the way most intrusions do, quietly, with fluorescent vests, a clipboard, and a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Paint marks appeared at dawn like rash, neon slashes on shoulder stone, X's at culvert mouths, crosses where the ditch eased into meadow. Stakes sprouted overnight, capped in red plastic, strung together by twine that hiccuped in the wind. The kind of theater people put on when they want to call a thing inevitable. By noon, a contractor's truck idled at the bottom of the S-curve. A drone buzzed above it, mapping angles I had memorized with my own feet. On the ridge, the HOA clubhouse watched like a square-shouldered lord over land it wished it owned. They had named the subdivision Lakes and Timbers, though the lake was dredged and the timbers were ornamental. It didn't matter. They had a logo, covenants, dues, and a president whose heels hit the clubhouse tile like gavels. The letter came in certified green. It said, "Access easement," the way a storm says chance of rain. The story, in their telling, was neat. The HOA planned a safety improvement that would convert my private lane into a shared loop to reduce traffic burden on their interior streets and provide emergency egress. They offered a stipend that wouldn't have repaved a driveway, let alone justified the surrender of a generational artery. There was a map with cheerful arrows and a dotted line that cut across my meadow like a scalpel. Community benefit, the letter said. Minimal impact. The signature at the bottom had a flourish, like a whip crack. I answered with filings, surveys, and the clean geometry of the county record, meets and bounds that dated back to 20, the year my grandfather felled 3 oaks to set the first gravel. I reminded them the road was mine, and not for lease to appease their mess of short cul-de-sacs and decorative speed bumps. Paper went back and forth. Phone calls lengthened. Voices stayed polite, but cooled like iron. The HOA president began to appear at the bottom of my lane with a folding smile and a posture that spoke fluent inevitability. She gestured at the paint marks as if they had always been there. The drone buzzed more often. The crew arrived on a Wednesday before dawn, orange lights turning dew to ember. There was no letter this time, only a laminate sign zip-tied to a sawhorse declaring road work, HOA improvement. They rolled a portable striping machine to the center of my lane and set cones as if they were priests arranging a rite. I stood at the porch rail and watched a line of fresh white smear forward, steady and sure, across gravel I had tamped by hand in springs that tasted of rain and diesel. By mid-morning, they had widened the mouth at the county lane and compacted. New shoulders with a vibrating drum that rattled bolts loose in my workshop. Where my creek crossing curved like a hip, they straightened it with a steel edge grader, shaving off the soft bend that kept tires slow and the underside of the land cool. They installed a stop sign with the HOA logo at its base, as if ownership could be patented in powder coat. It wasn't an easement, it was absorption, masquerading as help. Traffic arrived the next day as if invited, which of course it had been. Newsletter blasts, group chats, a celebratory post with the president, framed against my meadow, calling the loop a triumph of community planning. SUVs and golf carts discovered the shortcut, like ants discovering honey. They skimmed down the S-curve without regard for the way sound carries along the creek, or the way gravel kicks into saplings. Afternoon walks that had been conversations with wind became calculations in physics, timing steps between metal. Children's bikes appeared where they never had, their bell chimes pretty and terrifying in equal measure. The road forgot the discipline of a single steward and learned the carelessness of many. The damage wrote itself fast. The new shoulder bled into ditch, then into meadow. Dust, which had always floated like a veil in July, now rose in dirty curtains and hung on the porch screens. The first rain turned the widened edges to pudding and cut ruts that water loved and deepened. One truck, half-ton and impatient, got itself lodged at the creek's crown and ate the bank trying to exit. I pulled it free with my tractor while the driver stared past me toward the clubhouse, as if help lived there, and not in the hand that owned the chain. I kept my ledger, because ledgers had saved my people before. Photos with timestamps, drone, shots of my own, flown low along the ditch to count fractures in the culvert, and the angle where the lane now poured runoff straight across pasture instead of around it. I calculated the cubic yardage of gravel I had spread each year, and the way their tires doubled the demand. I logged the calls to the county office and the non-committal replies that said the words jurisdictional complexity, like a shrug written in Latin. When the HOA completed its annexation theater, they added the last insult, a pair of aluminum signs with reflective letters that spelled the new loop's name. Their name, not mine. It was a coastal-sounding thing that had never met our dirt. They mounted the plaques in concrete just past my fence line, under the ghost of an elm we had lost to ice. When the wind pushed across the ridge, the plates hummed softly, like a tuning. Fork held to the throat of a patient who refused to sing. I learned, in those weeks, the rhythm of their assumption. Morning walkers who waved with the familiarity of entitlement. Teenagers who cut across my shoulder to pose for pictures at the creek. Landscaping crews who used my turnout as a staging area because it made their route more efficient. At dusk, when the sun laid copper across the S-curve, the HOA's security SUV parked at the widened mouth as if guarding a gate it had invented. I don't know whether the president believed they had law on their side or simply momentum. In some places, momentum is stronger than law because it's easier to keep moving than to be corrected. The day the mail truck skipped my box because cones had swallowed it, I understood that what they had taken wasn't convenience or gravel. It was time. Time I had planned to spend replacing fence posts or sanding the porch rail now belonged to a loop that fed a map I never drew. Every fix of mine had become an amenity of theirs. Their newsletter called it neighborly synergy. My ledger called it theft with punctuation. Retaliation arrived the way solutions sometimes do. Sideways, from the quiet corners of a mind, kept busy with chores. It was the night I sat at the porch table with the ledger open, columns of figures like fence posts marching into twilight, and the creek speaking in its rock-voiced way below the curve. The drone of tires was steady, the same note repeated until it stopped being irritating and became instructive. Each car hummed a little differently. Each car paused differently at the bend. Each car cast a shape on the ridgeline lights, the way migrating birds cast patterns against the moon. I set the pencil down and listened harder. Machines have signatures, the way handwriting does. Thickness of tire, height of chassis, distance between axles. The things that make strips of paint into reconnaissance devices also make them vulnerable to a patient witness. I remembered the old cattle scale my grandfather had rigged from a door, and springs to weigh calves when money was tight. I remembered the pass of a logging road above the ridge, where a friend ran a quarry and kept a surplus of Jersey barriers, cameras, and plate readers to track pilfered stone. I remembered the county surplus auction calendar. I remembered how the creek fog hugged the S-curve and swallowed outlines before they reached the ridge. The plan didn't burst into the room. It assembled itself like scaffolding rising around a shape I already understood. Not vandalism, not risk to life, not chaos for its own sake. Precision. Disappearance. A way to teach the HOA the cost of appropriation without touching a single blade of their sculpted fescue. I would not scream at a meeting or write another letter that found a trash can by lunchtime. I would speak in the native language of the loop they had stolen. Logistics. At dawn, I walked the road with a builder's eye, measuring with the stride I used for fence lines. I counted from county lane to creek mouth, and marked in my mind where fog thickened and where the grade rose just enough to make a brake light flare. I pictured a box swallowed by the ditch, quiet as a buried rock. I pictured a pair of posts that looked like nothing until they looked like everything. I pictured data coming home to roost where it had been born. By noon, the ledger had a new tab. Parts list, sources, dates. No improvisation, no hurry. Only a schedule that moved like a watch spring, coiling tighter with each truckload of HOA dust that settled on my porch screens. In the evenings, when the loop glowed red with taillights, I sat at the edge of the S-curve and rehearsed the geometry of vanishing. Each car that slid through my land without permission drew its own diagram. Each diagram solved itself in my head and left behind a hollow where patience collected. The road had been a gift, and then a theft, and now it would be a lesson. They had taken the S-curve had always been a line I knew by heart, but after the theft, I began to study it like a craftsman inspecting wood grain. Morning light revealed one pattern, dusk another. I watched how fog lay like a blanket just above the asphalt, swallowing anything lower than a headlight. I measured the space between the twin sycamores where branches arched like a gate, hiding movement from the county road. I counted the seconds it took for cars to pass from bend to rise, noting how engines labored differently depending on weight. My road had become a laboratory, and I was its only scientist. The ledger grew thicker. Alongside the old columns of damages and gravel loads, I scribbled blueprints with pencil smudges on their edges. The plan revolved around three principles: invisibility, precision, and inevitability. Invisibility, because this was not meant to be noticed until too late. Precision, because recklessness breeds evidence. Inevitability, because nothing frightens power more than a trap disguised as chance. The box itself began as an idea stolen from the quarryman up on the ridge. He had once shown me how he tracked stone thieves with a buried plate reader, a slab of sensors in a casing tough enough to survive mud and frost. The thing had read tires, weight, and speed without ever showing its face. His version was tied to cameras, catching plates and faces. Mine wouldn't need that. I didn't want plates or proof. I wanted absence. I scoured the county surplus auction like a crow picking through a field. Old way pads, military cargo cases, even steel conduits that could pass as drainage parts. I bought what nobody else bid on, dragging it home in the bed of my pickup, while neighbors eyed me with the suspicion that comes when someone minds his business too well. At night, I laid the pieces on the barn foundation, arranging them by size and potential. The barn they had destroyed was gone, but its footprint became my workshop. From the lumber yard, I gathered treated beams, pressure-sealed against rot, and cut them to lengths that would fit flush with the ditch line. I built a frame sturdy enough to hold the weight of any SUV the HOA could parade. Into it went the guts, reinforced plates from the way pads, wired not to measure, but to trigger. I taught myself the circuitry by lantern light, soldering connections until sparks behaved the way I wanted. When I tested it with the weight of my tractor rolling overhead, the box hummed with recognition. It knew something had passed, and it knew what to do next. The next was always the hardest part. How do you vanish cars without lifting a finger against them? That was the puzzle I gnawed like a bone. Wreckage was messy, dangerous, and immoral. Theft was too obvious. But displacement, that was elegant. Make a car leave where it shouldn't. Make it unavailable. Make it forgotten. The creek and fog gave me cover, but not destination. Destination had to be chosen. South of my ridge, past a stretch of cedar thicket, there lay an abandoned logging spur. It curved off the county road into nothing, overgrown with briars and haunted by rusted cables left like dead snakes. No one used it, not since the mill closed 20 years ago. But the gravel base remained, wide enough for vehicles, hidden enough that headlights vanished the moment they turned. The spur became the answer, a place where cars could slip quietly out of circulation, lined up like cattle waiting for an auction no one announced. I walked the distance from the S-curve to that spur a dozen times, measuring with my stride, imagining the flow. A device in the ditch, a command buried under fog, a coaxed wheel turning not left but right. Modern cars are obedient to signals most drivers never hear. Keyless entries, fobs, override systems meant for convenience. To the patient, these are not conveniences. They are invitations. So I married the box to a transmitter. When weight crossed the S-curve, when fog hid the ridge from curious eyes, the system would whisper to the car's brain. A keyless unlock, a false start, a steering nudge timed with the bend. Nothing violent, nothing that left scars, just persuasion, strong enough to make a driver believe he had made a choice. And then, before anyone could doubt, the spur would open like a throat, swallowing cars one by one. The first dry run came on a Tuesday, when the air was cool enough for breath to show. I loaded the box into the ditch myself, tamping earth around its edges, until it looked like nothing more than a drainage project abandoned halfway. I tested the connections, buried the wires beneath grass that would soon root again, and stood back as the road looked ordinary once more. Then I waited. The HOA's newsletter had bragged about increased efficiency now that my road was officially theirs. Efficiency meant traffic, and traffic meant test subjects. The first SUV rolled through at 7:13 p.m., a glossy white one with vanity plates I'd seen often at the clubhouse. Its headlights cut the fog, its tires hissed on damp gravel, and the box recognized the weight with a vibration I felt in the soil under my boots. The transmitter sent its whisper. The SUV blinked, hesitated, then eased toward the spur as if it belonged there. The driver's brake lights flared once, uncertain, then vanished into the trees. Silence reclaimed the curve. I held my breath for a full minute, listening. No crash, no horn, no panic. Just absence. The car had gone where it wasn't supposed. And the road had sealed behind it, like water over a stone. By midnight, 3 more cars had followed. All HOA residents, all machines that had trespassed across my stolen lane as if entitlement were a compass. They were now lined quietly in the spur, engines stilled, owners puzzled somewhere in houses they never reached. The ledger received a new column that night. Returned absence. For every gravel load they had cost me, I would tally a vehicle gone missing, not destroyed but redirected, removed like weeds plucked from rows of corn. One for one, until the balance shifted. The news spread slower than I expected. At first, whispers of strange detours at the curve, drivers swearing they had taken a wrong turn despite knowing the way. A trick of fog, they said. Faulty GPS. Stress. But the HOA president did not believe in coincidence. By the end of the week, she had parked her own car at the mouth of the road, arms folded, sunglasses hiding whatever calculation churned behind them. She waited, expecting to catch a vandal with paint or wire cutters. She did not look into the ditch where the box lay humming, invisible, inevitable. I watched her from the porch, ledger open, pencil ready. She thought control was maintained by presence and threat. She didn't understand that control was just as easily maintained by absence. The first phase was complete. Cars could vanish without a trace. But the next phase would demand more daring, because soon the HOA would realize this was no accident. And when they did, the real war over my stolen road would begin. At first, the disappearances were treated as quirks. Drivers muttered about fog thicker than usual, about GPS units sending them wrong, about brief moments of confusion where the S-curve blurred into a turn they didn't mean to take. The HOA president smiled through clenched teeth at board meetings, calling it driver error and temporary adjustment. But cars kept vanishing, and quirks don't stack like bricks. Within 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. Monday mornings, an SUV never reached the office lot. Thursday nights, a sedan didn't return from a grocery run. Weekends, entire carpools meant for soccer tournaments evaporated into the cedar thicket where the spur swallowed headlights whole. Each case ended the same. Cars discovered hours later, idling silent on gravel no one had touched for decades, owners insisting they hadn't meant to turn there, families staring as if hypnotized by their own keys. The HOA couldn't deny what the community now whispered openly. The road had become haunted, not by ghosts in white sheets, but by something sharper, something unseen that turned familiarity into absence. And in their desperation, they made the first of many mistakes. They brought in security. A white SUV with magnetic logos and a yellow light bar began circling the loop day and night. Guards leaned out with flashlights, tapping notebooks as if jotting down the ghosts' names. They parked at the S-curve for hours, staring into fog that made the trees look like specters. But their presence didn't matter. The box didn't care about logos or uniforms. It only cared about weight, about signatures measured in axles and chassis. And so, even with security parked within sight, cars kept peeling away from the curve into silence. One guard's own sedan was taken on a shift. He swore he hadn't touched the wheel. He swore the car pulled itself into the thicket, as if the road had decided his route. By dawn, he had quit, refusing to return no matter how much the HOA offered. That story spread faster than any newsletter ever could. The president doubled down. She hosted an emergency town hall inside the clubhouse, standing before a projector that displayed maps and traffic charts. Her red suit looked sharper than steel under fluorescent lights, her voice hard as gravel. She spoke of sabotage, of enemies to the community, of the need for vigilance and solidarity. But the faces in the crowd weren't convinced. Their lips pursed, their arms crossed, their eyes darted like mice in a field where hawks circled overhead. They had lost too much, too fast. I watched from the porch, sipping coffee as headlights trickled past like fireflies, Every car was a note in a song only I could hear. The ledger grew thicker, columns marked with dates, times, models, and the simple word redirected. Not wrecked, not ruined, simply absent where they were supposed to be. A different kind of justice, quieter than lawsuits and louder than complaints. But balance is a fragile thing. As more cars disappeared, suspicion fractured the community. Neighbors accused neighbors of pranks, of hacking, of criminal mischief. One man claimed teenagers were behind it, using stolen fobs. Another insisted it was a software glitch in moderner vehicles. No one wanted to admit the truth. Their shortcut had cost them more than convenience. The president, unwilling to accept helplessness, escalated again. This time, she called the county sheriff. Patrol cars lined the S-curve one night, their red and blue lights painting the fog in colors that looked like bruises. Deputies stood with arms crossed, boots planted, eyes sharp. They laid down spikes, thinking they would catch a phantom driver. They set up cameras on tripods, lenses blinking like insect eyes. They walked the ditch with flashlights, missing the box by inches. The sheriff himself declared it a containment measure. His voice carried into microphones from local reporters who had arrived to smell blood in the water. The story of the vanishing cars had leapt beyond the HOA's fences, drawing outsiders eager for spectacle. The president smiled stiffly into the cameras, insisting they would restore order. That night, 3 more cars vanished under their noses. One deputy's cruiser joined them. The sheriff left before dawn, jaw clenched so tight it looked wired shut. Reporters lingered long enough to catch the panic in residents' eyes, broadcasting it across the county. By the next evening, the road was empty. No one dared drive it unless forced. The shortcut that had been their pride became a curse they whispered about, warning guests to avoid. For me, the silence was delicious. The S-curve once again sounded like itself. Wind in sycamores, creek chuckling over stone, the distant bark of a dog on the ridge. My road, my rhythm, restored by absence. Yet I knew it couldn't last forever. Fear is powerful, but arrogance never stays quiet. The HOA president wasn't finished. She launched what she called the Recovery Initiative. It was written in bold letters across flyers, shoved into mailboxes, and taped to lampposts. She promised towing contracts, private investigators, and legal action against whoever was responsible. She blamed nameless saboteurs, stirring residents to anger rather than resignation. She made the vanishing cars sound like an attack, not on property, but on pride. And pride, as I had already learned, is the only thing more dangerous than greed. Still, the initiative floundered. Towing companies refused contracts once they learned trucks were disappearing too. Investigators quit after finding nothing but fog and silence. Lawsuits had no target. Every plan she pushed collapsed like wet cardboard. And with each failure, her authority eroded, piece by piece, until her speeches sounded like echoes in an empty hall. But desperation sharpens resolve. And it was in her desperation that she made the boldest move yet. She decided to test the road herself. One Friday evening, just before dusk, the president parked her luxury SUV at the top of the S-curve. Cameras followed, hired crews documenting her defiance. She wore the same red suit she always did when she needed to project control. With a confident smile, she declared the road safe and that she would prove it personally. She didn't know I was watching from the trees. She didn't know the box was humming under her tires, waiting like a patient predator. She didn't know that inevitability had no respect for cameras or pride. When her SUV eased into the curve, brake lights flared. For a second, she hesitated, gripping the wheel tighter than usual. Then the whisper reached her car. The vehicle shifted, obedient as a dog, and steered toward the cedar thicket. The cameras followed. Reporters gasped, residents screamed, and the president's SUV vanished into the spur, as if swallowed whole. Silence fell heavier than stone. By dawn, the HOA's leader was gone, not dead, not hurt, but absent, stranded, in the very place she had tried to deny. And with her disappearance, the community's illusion of control shattered completely. The vanishing had become undeniable. The HOA had stolen my road, but now their cars, their pride, their very leader, were mine to take. Yet the story wasn't finished, because when a community loses its head, chaos doesn't dissolve. It spreads. The president's disappearance hit like a lightning strike through dry timber. For years, her presence had been the HOA's spine, her voice sharp as nails, her posture straight as a fence post, her red suit a uniform of power. When her SUV slid into the cedar thicket and failed to return, the illusion of order evaporated. At first, residents clung to hope. They told themselves it was a stunt, a staged performance to prove a point about safety. They waited at the EE clubhouse with phones in hand, expecting her to reappear with a smile and a speech about resilience. But hours stretched into a night, and dawn brought nothing but silence. Her vehicle sat abandoned in the spur, headlights dim, papers scattered across the dashboard like confetti after a failed parade. She wasn't inside. Rumors sprouted faster than weeds after rain. Some swore she had fled the county to avoid accountability. Others whispered about kidnappers, about enemies from rival neighborhoods, about ghosts in the fog. The most fearful said the road itself had swallowed her, hungry for penance after being stolen. No explanation satisfied everyone. What mattered was the vacuum she left behind. Without a leader, the HOA board flailed. Meetings devolved into shouting matches where members accused each other of cowardice, of incompetence, of conspiracy. The treasurer resigned publicly, slamming a folder onto the table before storming out. The secretary followed 2 days later, refusing to take responsibility for madness. By the end of the week, the board was half empty, its authority dissolved into bickering fragments. Meanwhile, the road grew quieter. No one wanted to drive it, yet many had no choice. Deliveries still came. Commuters still cut across. Each trip carried the weight of dread. Headlights dimming as fog thickened, hands tightening on steering wheels. Every driver knew the risk, that their car might not reach its destination, that it might slip into absence no one could explain. And cars continued to vanish. Minivans, pickups, sedans. They all obeyed the whisper from the ditch. Families found themselves stranded on foot, clutching groceries or backpacks, while their vehicles sat lined like tombstones in the spur. The pile grew so large that the sheriff ordered a mass tow, hauling dozens of abandoned cars to a storage yard miles away. But even as tow trucks rumbled down the road, more vehicles vanished behind them. The spur refilled faster than it could be emptied. The community panicked. Homeowners, who once boasted about rising property values, now muttered about selling, though no buyers came. Children refused to ride in cars near the S-curve, crying until parents turned back. Teenagers filmed themselves daring each other to drive through, their shaky videos spreading online, fueling the legend of the vanishing road. Outsiders began showing up, thrill-seekers hoping to witness the phenomenon. Some parked at the county lane, peering into the fog like pilgrims. At a shrine, the HOA tried to control the narrative. Flyers declared the disappearances were isolated incidents caused by driver error. Emails insisted on community unity. But residents weren't fooled. They had lost too much, too quickly. And with the president gone, no one feared the board anymore. Rebellion bloomed. Dues went unpaid. Rules went ignored. Lawns grew shaggy. Fences leaned. Garbage bins stayed on curbs for days. What had once been a tightly regulated community began to unravel into disorder. Without the constant threat of fines and notices, residents rediscovered freedom, and they clung to it. Bonfires replaced. Neighborhood watch meetings. Unapproved sheds popped up overnight. Chickens roamed freely across manicured lawns. The HOA's control had dissolved as thoroughly as their leader had. From my porch, I watched the chaos spread like cracks in glass. The road that had been stolen from me had become their undoing, not through violence, but through absence. Each car that vanished was a lesson written in fog and silence. Take what isn't yours, and something of yours will be taken in return. But victory didn't taste sweet. It tasted inevitable. I hadn't screamed, hadn't fought, hadn't raised a hand. I had simply let the road speak in its own language, one they had refused to understand. Still, I knew arrogance never dies quietly. The HOA wasn't finished yet. Desperation drives people to madness, and madness drives them to extremes. With their president gone and their authority unraveling, the board members who remained plotted one final attempt to seize control. They announced a community recovery operation, boasting that they would cleanse the road and restore order. They brought in contractors, this time with heavier machinery, graders, rollers, even a crane. Their plan was crude: dig up the S-curve, rip out its heart, and rebuild it under their authority. They thought asphalt could erase memory, that steel could silence what the land remembered. I knew better. The box in the ditch was not fragile. It was buried deep, reinforced, patient. Machines couldn't silence it, only awaken it. And when their equipment rolled into place, when diesel engines growled against the fog, I felt the ground hum with inevitability. The first grader vanished before it reached the bend. A machine so heavy it shook, windows disappeared as easily as a sedan. The workers scrambled, shouting into radios, their headlights swallowed whole. The crane followed, its boom tilting like a mast before slipping into absence. By dawn, the spur was lined not just with cars, but with machinery. Monuments of steel and arrogance parked in silent defeat. The HOA board collapsed entirely after that. Members resigned en masse, some fleeing the county altogether. The clubhouse was shuttered, its doors chained, its windows dark. Residents cheered the end of their rule, but beneath the celebration lingered unease. The road was still there, quiet as ever, waiting. And me? I sat with the ledger open, pencil scratching calmly across the page. For every car, every machine, every fragment of arrogance that vanished, I marked a line. Balance, tallied, and complete. Yet even as I closed the book, I knew the story wasn't over. The HOA had been destroyed, but outsiders had begun to take notice. The legend of the vanishing road spread further each day, drawing eyes I had never intended to attract. The war with the HOA was finished, but a new storm was gathering beyond the county line. What happens when the world discovers a place where cars simply cease to exist? That was the question waiting in the fog, and I would have to answer it. The HOA was gone, collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance, but the road did not rest. Word of its hunger traveled faster than wind through corn. First came the whispers in nearby towns. a road where cars vanished, where drivers swore. They hadn't turned yet, found themselves miles away in an abandoned spur. Local reporters sniffed out the story, then state journalists, and soon the legend of the vanishing road grew beyond county lines. I had never wanted attention. My ledger was a private book, my revenge a private act. But the world has a way of sniffing out weakness, and a community without an HOA was carrion to scavengers. They came in flocks. The first were thrill-seekers. Teenagers from nearby suburbs drove out in clattering pickups, daring each other to drive the S-curve at midnight. They filmed shaky videos with their phones, headlights darting through fog, voices cracking between laughter and fear. Some returned, pale-faced, swearing their cars had tried to turn on their own. Others didn't return at all, not until morning, when their vehicles sat lined in the spur, engines cold, doors locked as if waiting for permission to move again. Then came the entrepreneurs. Men in polo shirts and shiny shoes arrived with clipboards and cameras. They spoke of tourism potential, of branding the mystery, of turning the vanished road into an attraction. They proposed ghost tours, merchandise, even a theme park. They saw profit where others saw curse. But when their rental vans failed to return from the curve, their enthusiasm vanished too. Authorities followed close behind. The sheriff, humiliated by his earlier failure, petitioned the state for reinforcements. Highway patrol cruisers patrolled the loop. State engineers rolled in with survey equipment, measuring distances, scanning for electromagnetic anomalies. Scientists from a nearby university arrived with instruments on tripods, muttering about interference and unexplained frequencies. They all looked at the road as a problem to be solved, as if asphalt could be reduced to numbers. But the road wasn't theirs to solve. Each group left with less than they brought. Patrol cars lined the spur beside HOA sedans. Survey drones blinked, in silence, from the trees where they had crashed. Tripods stood abandoned in ditches, their owners unwilling to return for them. The legend deepened with every failure, the road's hunger swelling with each new witness. Residents, freed from HOA shackles but chained by fear, adapted in strange ways. Some avoided the road entirely, carving ruts across their own lawns to bypass the S-curve. Others drove it with talismans hanging from mirrors, muttering prayers under their breath. A few leaned into the legend, charging visitors for guided tours, promising them a chance to face the vanishing. Their greed ended the same way the HOAs had. Parked in the spur, engines dead, pride drained. From my porch, I watched the invasion unfold. Cars that had never belonged here now swarmed the road daily, their presence loud and disrespectful. The ledger thickened faster than ever, my pencil racing to keep up with dates and models. I had created balance against the HOA, but now the scales tipped wildly as outsiders fed the road's appetite. What had been precise justice threatened to become chaos, and chaos attracts predators. One night, long after the fog had settled like milk in the valley, a convoy of black SUVs rolled quietly into the loop. Their windows were tinted, their plates unmarked, their headlights dimmed. Men in dark suits stepped out, not speaking, not filming, not joking like the thrill-seekers before them. They carried cases and devices I didn't recognize, and they walked the S-curve with the discipline of soldiers. They weren't here to mock or to profit. They were here to take. I watched from the trees, heart steady, knowing the box in the ditch was humming beneath their boots. The road doesn't care about uniforms or orders. It only cares about signatures, weight, timing, inevitability. When their leader gave a signal, and their first SUV rolled forward. The whisper reached it. The engine hesitated, the lights flickered, and the vehicle obeyed, steering into the cedar thicket. The others followed, one by one, until the spur swallowed the entire convoy. The men shouted into radios that no longer worked. They chased after the disappearing lights, but fog is a better ally than any soldier. By dawn, the SUVs sat in neat rows among sedans, pickups, and graders, their black paint gleaming dully under a pale sky. The men were gone. I returned to the porch with my ledger, pencil shaking for the first time. This was no longer just revenge. This was something bigger, something spilling beyond intention. The road had grown from a tool into a force, and forces are not easily contained. The county panicked. News helicopters buzzed overhead, filming aerial shots of the spur lined with vehicles like an open-air graveyard. State officials issued statements about safety hazards and ongoing investigations. Rumors spread of quarantines, of military involvement, of secret deals to buy out the land. Property values, already ruined by the HOA's collapse, fell into a pit no realtor could climb out of. The residents, trapped between legend and fear, abandoned their homes. One by one, houses emptied. Lawns grew wild, shutters sagged, mailboxes rusted. The community that had stolen my road became a ghost town, its silence broken only by the occasional daredevil or scavenger who thought themselves immune to the curse. None were. I had won against the HOA, but victory had mutated. The road was mine again, yet no longer mine alone. It belonged to something deeper, to history, to inevitability, to the balance my grandfather had laid when he first carved gravel into pasture. The box in the ditch was just a vessel. The true power lay in the land itself, awakened by arrogance, sharpened by revenge. And still, people came. By late summer, the road was a national story. News anchors spoke of the vanishing highway. Scientists debated theories of magnetism, of portals, of sabotage. Bloggers called it proof of conspiracy. Pilgrims arrived with offerings, leaving trinkets at the S-curve like gifts to a god. No one understood. Few dared drive it, but all wanted to stand near, to see, to feel. From my porch, I watched them all. Thrill-seekers, entrepreneurs, scientists, soldiers, pilgrims, each believing they could bend the road to their will. Each ending the same way. Absent, silent, parked in neat rows among the cedars. The HOA had taken my road without asking. I had taken everything they valued in return. But now, the road had taken on a hunger of its own, fed by outsiders who refused to respect it. Balance had been restored against the HOA. Against the world, balance had only just begun. And as the rows of abandoned vehicles stretched further into the spur, I realized the endgame was approaching. The road no longer served my revenge. It served itself. And soon, it would demand something even greater. By autumn, the road was no longer a shortcut, no longer even a place to travel. It had become a destination. The county posted warning signs, the state erected barricades, yet people still came. Curiosity is stronger than caution, and arrogance is stronger than both. They came with cameras, with prayers, with machines. They came knowing what waited, and they came anyway. And still, the road took them. The spur had become a graveyard of steel. Rows upon rows of vehicles, silent and obedient, lined the overgrown gravel. Sedans with vines crawling across their hoods. SUVs sunken into mud. Trucks with flat tires, doors locked, keys still inside. and beyond them, the heavy machines, the graders, the cranes, the black SUVs, all waiting as if in some final parade. The cedar thicket whispered around them, branches bending like ribs enclosing a lung. The air there was different now. Not just fog, but something thicker, heavier, as if the land itself was breathing. The box in the ditch still hummed, but I knew it had long since stopped being the cause. It was just a key that had opened a door. The road itself was awake now, and it did not sleep again. The world outside could not leave it alone. News anchors debated it nightly. Preachers declared it a portal to judgment. Scientists argued over magnetic anomalies and gravitational faults. The military cordoned off the county road for a week, then abandoned it after a convoy vanished in full view of their own cameras. Conspiracy theorists called it proof of everything from aliens to ancient curses. But no one agreed, and no one could stop it. Through it all, I kept my ledger. At first, it had been numbers, dates, models, the cold arithmetic of revenge. One column for each theft, one tally for each act of balance. But, as the pages filled, my hand slowed. It was no longer just about cars. It was about people, faces glimpsed in fog, voices shouting before silence, lives diverted into absence. The ledger had begun as evidence. Now it felt like confession. I walked the road often, not with pride, but with vigilance. I traced the S-curve with my boots, listening to the creek that still chuckled under its stones, watching the fog curl like smoke through sycamores. Sometimes, in the mist, I thought I saw figures moving, drivers searching for their cars, or perhaps shadows of those who had gone missing. But when the wind shifted, the shapes dissolved. The community was gone. Houses abandoned, lawns wild, mailboxes bent. The clubhouse stood empty, windows shattered by storms, its logo fading in the sun. The HOA that had once ruled with arrogance had left nothing but silence behind. They had stolen my road to build their empire, and in the end, the road had devoured the empire itself. Yet the hunger spread beyond them. Outsiders still vanished. Scientists still failed. And the spur filled further each month. The rows of vehicles grew so long that even birds avoided flying overhead, as if sensing the gravity of absence below. I began to wonder if the road's appetite would ever end. Then one night, as fog pooled thicker than milk, I stood at the ditch and listened. The box hummed beneath my boots, steady as always, but softer now, as if fading. The hum had been my ally, my tool. Without it, the balance I had crafted might unravel. I crouched down, brushed dirt from the casing, and felt the warmth of metal against my palm. For a moment, I considered tearing it out, ending it all with a wrench and a spade. But as my hand lingered, the ground itself vibrated. Not the box, but deeper, older, a low tremor, steady as a heartbeat, rising from the earth. I realized then what I had refused to admit. The box had not created the hunger. It had merely spoken the first word of a language the land already knew. The road had always held the power. My family had only carved its skin. The HOA had only awakened its memory, and I, in my thirst for justice, had given it permission to speak. The weight of that truth settled heavy in my chest. Revenge had felt righteous when it was measured in gravel loads and barn beams, but now it was something else entirely, something I no longer controlled. Balance had become hunger. Justice had become appetite. And the road, once mine, now belonged only to itself. So I made my decision. I packed the ledger, heavy with years of ink, into an oilskin wrap. I walked the S-curve one last time, tracing its bend, listening to the creek laugh under the stones. At the cedar thicket, where fog thickened and the spur yawned like a mouth, I laid the ledger down among the rows of silent cars. A record of everything that had been taken, of everything that had vanished, of everything that could never return. My confession to the land. As I turned to leave, the fog shifted. For a moment, I thought I heard voices, faint, layered, like echoes carried from far away. Not screams, not cries, but whispers. Calm, inevitable, patient. They belonged to the road now, just as my road had once belonged to me. By dawn, I had packed what I needed. Tools, keepsakes, photographs of the barn before its fall. I locked the house and walked away, not down the road, but across pasture and ridge. The land beyond still belonged to silence, and silence was all I wanted. The world will never understand the road. They will keep coming, drawn by curiosity, arrogance, greed. They will keep vanishing. The spur will keep filling until the trees themselves bow under the weight of absence. And one day, perhaps, the road will stretch its hunger further than the S-curve, further than the cedar thicket, further than my county. But by then, I will be gone. What began as theft ended as lesson. The HOA thought ownership could be written in bylaws and painted in stripes. I thought revenge could be tallied in ledgers and balanced with absence. We were both wrong. Ownership belongs to the land, and the land does not forget. The road was mine once. Then it was theirs. Now it belongs only to itself. And somewhere in the fog, the ledger waits. Pages filled, balance struck, hunger recorded. A monument not to me, not to the HOA, but to inevitability itself. The road does not forgive. The road does not forget. The road only waits.